to make a presentation to us. While they're getting ready, so as I understand matters, we're going to hear from the team at Becca and staff about the monitoring, upgrade and technology review. And following that, then we'll convene the formal meeting to, if agreeable, consider and endorse the report that's presented. And then we take it from there, but unless someone else tells me that's not what we're doing, that's where we are.
No, bang on. Kia ora. So, yeah, just as a way of introduction, I guess. So the 5-yearly monitoring, upgrade and technology review report is a condition of our main discharge consent for the wastewater treatment network. It requires us to look at a variety of things over the previous 4 or 5 years, as well as have a future focus towards what else might be out there in terms of technology, how we're measuring up against our compliance, how we're measuring in terms of some of the things that were put into the original consent around things like smart growth targets, waste minimisation, as well as give a broad, I guess, review of the upgrades and monitoring that we've done over the course of that period. It also allows for input from local tangata whenua. The condition in the consent doesn't really specify how that is to be done. It's quite open in that respect. And this year, for the first time, we have tried to integrate inputs from tangata whenua into the main report. Previously, there have been separate reports that have stood alone with their own recommendations, and we've tried to make that more cohesive and collaborative approach this time, which I think has been a success and has been very beneficial for all of us. So I appreciate the work that's been done on that. Yeah, so Christina and Becca and Tarangi Māori will be running us through a presentation of that. But obviously, we'll try not to go whole in with a 200-odd page report. We'll try and keep it as light as we can, but there'll be times when we need to delve a little bit into some of the technical compliance stuff, I'm sure. Yeah. Anything to add to that? No?
Thank you, Redley. So I'd just like to introduce myself and introduce our team as well. We have Tarangi Māori online. So kia ora tātou, my name is Christina Hermans. I'm a senior principal at Becca. I've been lucky enough to work with Tauranga City Council on a number of projects for, since about 2007. And I'm a Three Waters engineer and have worked mainly in the New Zealand and Pacific sector for the last 30 years. So my role on this project has been as a project manager. And I'd like to introduce Garrett Hall. Garrett, would you like to introduce yourself?
Kia ora koutou, Garrett Hall. I'm a technical director, technical fellow at Becca. My specialist area is wastewater consenting. I've been looking specifically at the consent compliance, environmental monitoring, but also the legislative framework changing. I was involved in the previous review back in 2019. Kia ora.
Te rangi Marie?
Tēnā tātou, ko te rangi Māori Williams ahau he uri ahau no ngai tūhoi, Ngāti Whakaue, Taranaki me Ngāti Hauiti. My apologies, I couldn't be there in person today. I've unfortunately had a tummy bug the last 24 hours. My background is as a resource management lawyer, and then in more recent years, I've been supporting iwi in the resource consenting policy and planning space, and I've sat on this committee in the past, and I sit on the program business case, TCC's wastewater program business case, and have done a bit of mahi in the cultural impact assessment space for wastewater and tauranga. I was appointed by the tangata whenua reps to input into this report on behalf of tangata whenua. Kia ora.
Kia ora te rangi Marie. So I'm just going to take you through a little bit of what we're going to talk about for the next hour and a half. So just an overview. So as Radley said, the purpose of this hui is to look at performance over the last 5 years. It's a requirement of consent conditions for your wastewater network, and also to look at recommendations for improving the wastewater activity going forward as well. We're going to give you a little bit, because some of you are really familiar with Taranga's wastewater scheme, and some of you it may be just a little bit new, so we'll give you an overview. Garrett will take us through, Garrett will do that, and then Te Rangi Marie will take us through a bit of performance and consent compliance review. And then I'll talk to you about some things to do with minimising waste, smart growth, technological advances, and then Garrett will take us through legislation and policy. And then we'll end up with some conclusions and recommendations. One of the key recommendations out of this review is the implementation of a kaitiaki monitoring plan. So Te Rangi Marie will tell you a little bit more about what's proposed there. And all going well, we'll be finishing at 2 o'clock, the workshop portion of this. So
I was just going to add to that. So in the report, I'm not expecting everyone to have read every page, but you'll see that this is a draft. There is still some additional information to be provided and included into the report, but that's really around some of the monitoring that we do, having the actual reports and field sheets and that still need to be included. So it's, what would you say, 90
it's 90% there,
yeah.
And it's just really tidy ups and clarifications. So please, please understand that it is a draft report.
So if you've seen little things that you're not sure about, or things where it says error, where you still need, error, there's a report or whatever, that's just the sort of tidy up stuff that we still need to do.
So on the board there is just some of the other key members who are not here today, because today we're talking about conclusions and recommendations, but have actually provided intersections there. So we've had Gary McDonald and John Crawford, who are wastewater technical specialists from Becca, and they've authored the technological advances section. And Sharon DeLuca from Boffa School. Sharon is a well-known marine ecologist, and so she is the one who assesses all the ecological monitoring. And of course, myself and Te Rangi Marie. Over to you, Garrett. Or is this me? It's me. Might be you and me, Radley. you want to give a little bit of an overview of your wastewater system?
All right. So, I think it's most of you should know this. So apologies if I'm going over old ground. But essentially, that's the network. We have 2 treatment plants, one either side of the bridge. Chapel Street takes the majority of the mature part of the city with Matua, Bethlehem. Bethlehem. It also takes wastewater from Omokara as part of a MOU we have with Western Bay, and the discharge from Chapel Street goes over the bridge and back to Tamanga. Tamanga takes obviously the coastal strip, but it also receives wastewater from the newer parts, Toriko, some of Welcome Bay, through what we call the Southern Pipeline. And that essentially enables us to cater for the growth that's currently occurring in that part of the city. There is a connection between the 2 plants, both at the front end and also at the back end. So at the front end, we're able to dial where the flows go, whether they go across the Southern Pipeline or go to Chapel Street, depending on loading and hydraulic requirements. So when we're in just normal operation, we load Chapel Street as much as we can, and that's because we have the ability to reduce our costs by using the process at Chapel Street to create our own energy, and that obviously takes some of the pressure off. When we have a rain event, that's when we tend to send more towards Tamanga, where we have the flow balancing capabilities to cater for that extra flow that we see in a rain event. At the back end, they're combined. As I said, Chapel Street sends its discharge back over to Tamanga, where it goes through a series of wetlands, and the discharge from Tamanga also goes through a wetland, a pond system and wetland, before the flows are combined again and go out of what you see there is the blue line, and is 950 metres offshore outfall. There's, I always get this figure wrong, how many pump stations we have. A lot.
More than 150.
Yeah, it's well over 150 now. So, where we use gravity where we can, we do need pumps to enable us to make sure that all the wastewater gets where it needs to go, especially on the strip side, where obviously we haven't got the gravity situation there. A lot of that is pumped because the terrain is so flat.
So I'll hand over to Garrett now, and Garrett will just take us through an introduction to the consents that we're talking about.
Yes, so just some photos to start with. Chapel Street on the left there, Te Maunga in the middle, and also not just the treatment plants themselves, but there's a number of consents associated with the ponds. So just on the next slide, we have the list of the various consents. The main one at the top is the discharge consent. That's the main consent, and then there's associated consents with that, seepage through the oxidation ponds into land. And then there's some contingency type consents. There's an overflow from Chapel Street during extreme wet weather events. There's consents around the occupation, like the amount of space taken up on the coastal marine area or the seabed. There's some consents that haven't been used, for example, the discharge to land at 8 locations that's not actually being used. And then there's the air discharge consents, the discharge of odour, and quite a few monitoring conditions around that. And then there's, right at the bottom there, there's a consent that's actually expired around the landfill operation, but some consenting obligations that have carried over into the new consents, which we're still reporting in this report. So in terms of the scope of the review, it's set out in condition 20 of the original consent, and you've got the matters there that's specified in the consent, which is we've covered, and the period that's covered is since the last review, 2019 to 2024, and our reporting now in this year through to the Regional Council. So you've got some of the wording, and then we'll come back to this around, those issues which were key at the time of the consent around zero waste objectives, smart growth, stretch targets. It's also covering technological advances, wastewater management, treatment and disposal, but also alternatives, not only network alternatives, but also at the treatment plant, all the compliance and monitoring, but also the legislative changes, and we've had a lot of those changes happening over the last 5 years through successive governments, but also cost analysis and this idea of what is the best practicable option as it's determined in the RMA, and then an obligation around tangata whenua involvement, and as Christina talked about, we've taken a different approach this year with Te Rangi Mare integrating into our technical work. Next slide, Christina.
We've got some people here. We've got some people here who have been involved, some members of the committee who have been involved in previous MUSA or 5-yearly reviews. So this year we've taken a different approach. So previously there has been an independent consultant report, and then tangata whenua have been invited to provide comment on that through a cultural report. This last time around, it was decided that it would be beneficial to have the independent consultant work collaboratively with Te Rangi Mare as appointed by the tangata whenua. So what you would see in the report is recommendations from Becca, but also recommendations from Maraerea. But what we also have is combined recommendations, which we'll talk about. So I don't know if anyone who's been previously involved with MUSAs would like to reflect on how it's evolved over the last almost 20 years.
Yeah. Gotten better to me with the description, but it seems like I'm going on about it all the time, like in the relevant consents, 62722 and the other one. Again, to me, and I see it as that's why we missed it the last time about decommissioning. It should still be put in some in some sort of statement in there, so we're starting from the top. Knowing that it's decommissioned and whatever that means. That's all, because I'm sure that's how we missed it last time, Christina, you know what I mean? When, because it hasn't been mentioned in the language in here as and it was a big part of, at the time anyway, Ngā Pōtiki signing up to this whole thing. So I'll put it this way, I'm going to keep on commenting on that until I see that in there.
So spoilers, but there is, it is identified in there, Whiti. So as we'll go through, I'm sure when we reach that consent, you'll see where it's talked about.
I realise that, but I'm saying. I mean, and I realise that you mentioned it here, but not at top of the pops where, hey. So
I acknowledge that. I mean, I guess we were just providing a description of the consents, but. I get your point.
I mean, I was commenting to him before, when we first done it, we were like amateurs, especially us, you know what I mean? And as you say, like the last 20 years, we've got our heads around and stuff like that. And so in your second box there, we got the monitoring upgrade and all that. And the decommissioning of the pond, I'm saying you can attach that to the progress towards the zero waste as far as I'm concerned, and also the technical advantages attached to that, because then you can reason of why decommissioning the pond.
Thanks, Fitty. Are you happy for us to move on? I'd like to introduce Tarangi Maria, who's going to take us through each of the different consents and some of those conclusions and recommendations.
Can we do this? Can we continue with your report, and can we save our questions for the end? Because I'm just worried that if we're going to start chiming in on each point, that your hour and a half will quickly become Saturday, and then you know and the All Blacks are on. So yeah, let's go through your report, and then we'll hold our questions perhaps.
Ka pai. So this section of the report looks at, I think it's consent condition 20.1 D and E, which asks us to look at the results of sampling and monitoring, assess those results, and provide some commentary on the adequacy and scope of sampling and monitoring, as well as look at the compliance with each of the consent conditions. And so we've combined those two conditions into this one section of the report. And what we've done is gone through the conditions for each of those consents that Garrett referred to, and we've created a table which I think you should all have. And in that table, we look at the relevant conditions, whether there's compliance with those conditions, what Becca recommendations are, and what my recommendations are. But for the purpose of this presentation, we've summarised those conclusions and recommendations into a slide each for each consent. So I'll just talk through those. So consent 62878, which is the consent that allows the discharge into the ocean of wastewater, and it also allows the upgrade of the ocean outfall. So TCC is largely compliant with consent conditions, but we've identified that there could be some changes to conditions to get a better understanding of the effects to the environment, particularly cultural effects. And so, for example, some of the things that could be addressed is where there is an exceedance of contaminant levels, but they don't breach a consent condition, there could be follow-up investigations to understand whether there have been environmental effects. One of the conditions requires that TCC monitor tuatua, and for some of the years there have been no tuatua present, so there's been no monitoring for those years, so we could require alternative monitoring to understand effects. For some contaminant levels listed in the consent conditions, there are no standards to be met. And so what I understand is Becca has looked at some general standards or guidelines that are out there to understand what the levels mean. And for the mussel sampling, some of the arsenic levels are breached in terms of food safety guidelines. So yeah, I guess one of our recommendations is around bringing in standards for contaminant levels when there's sampling and monitoring of water quality or shellfish flesh or sediment testing. One of the consent conditions requires 2 broad spatial studies of benthic biota and sediments, but those are only required in 2014 and 2024, and the consent is until 2040. And our advice from Sharon is that it's not that helpful to monitor once every 10 years. So there's recommendations around monitoring more frequently and being able to have that spatial study again before 2040. So our recommendations for this consent is tightening up those conditions so that we can get a better understanding of effects to the environment. And a theme throughout a lot of these consent conditions is that a kaitiaki monitoring plan or program could be the way to address some of those gaps in understanding of those environmental effects. Can you do the next slide, please? So this consent 62881 allows wastewater seepage from the wastewater treatment ponds into the Mangatawa drain and out to Te Tahuna o Rangatawa. Again, largely compliant. The volume limits for seepages has not been exceeded. But again, there are no limits for water quality, and so we think it would be useful to have some limits so we can understand environmental effects, or if limits are breached, we can take steps to mitigate any effects on the environment. One thing that's been raised by Sharon is that it's questionable whether the monitoring of titiko is helpful. And again, this is something we can address through a condition review or through a kaitiaki monitoring plan. And another issue we identified for this consent was that there were some spikes in contaminant levels in water quality, and there's an assumption that this was due to the desludging of Pond 1, but we're not 100% sure about that, so we want to monitor that and report back to the committee as to whether that is the cause of the spikes.
Radley, do you want to explain a little bit about those particular ponds, just for those who aren't familiar as to what's actually in those ponds?
Yeah, so the ponds as you see them there are historically Mount Burrow put them in as their treatment for the wastewater network. When Tamanga was built, there were some changes made, and these consents were applied for, so that the second pond, you see the portion on the far right is now what we call wetland C, and that was divided up. Pond 1 was originally the sludge pond for the Mount Burrow, and when Tamanga was built, the sludge continued to be deposited there for stabilisation, essentially. When Whiti refers to the decommissioning of the pond, there's a condition around decommissioning that pond in terms of the sludge, and in 2019 we commissioned the thickening and dewatering plant, which allowed us to stop putting sludge into the pond. Essentially, those ponds and wetlands are used as a flow balancing device as part of the outfall system as a whole. It enables us to mitigate those peak events and protect the environment from the treatment plant discharging into it, other than through the outfall.
Thanks, Radley. Tarangi Mario.
Apai, so consent 67894 allowed for sludge in the ponds to be disposed at the landfill. This consent expired in 2024, and there is no more sludge disposal at the landfill. And I understand all sludge goes to vermi composting now. There are a number of non-compliances with this consent. And a significant issue is that the leachate collection system around the landfill, as well as the stormwater system, they both have not been operating appropriately, which would result in leachate leaching out of the landfill into the surrounding environment, including the harbour. Because the consent has expired and because the landfill issues are being addressed directly between council and Ngā we haven't made any recommendations in relation to this consent, besides leaving this to TCC and Ngā to work through the reconsenting of the landfill discharges.
Thanks, Te Rangi Maria. So, effectively, there has been some progress, but effectively what we're saying is that we're separating this one out because it's already being dealt through, I suppose, a separate kaupapa. But Radley, do you want to just provide a bit of a progress update on what Tauranga City is doing with regard to the leachate collection and stormwater system?
So the landfill itself has a number of different consents that sit with it. Some of them are waters consents, such as the sludge disposal. Others sit with the sustainability and waste team as part of their ongoing monitoring, I guess, of the landfill since it closed. And that's where those discussions are happening. Those consents need renewing. They run out this year, I believe. And there's an ongoing discussion at the moment with Ngā around how we are looking at the best practical option for improving and upgrading the leachate system and a capping that will reduce the amount of water that's actually entering that landfill and creating some of those leachate issues. So that's currently where it's at. The consents have been applied for and I believe the team are working with Ngā at the moment on the best practical option scenarios for funding, which I believe is in this year. Funding for the leachate upgrade? Yeah. So we're working on the designs and the funding is in the annual plan for that.
Ka pai. So the next two consents are the air discharge consents for Chapel Street and Te Maunga. These are largely compliant. We are still waiting on a few more details in terms of the odour management plan and whether TCC complied with what's set out in those plans in terms of remedial action to be taken when there are odour complaints.
I think we've actually got those now, Te Rangi Maria. We just need to update our report.
Okay, ka pai. Again, the conditions don't include trigger levels, which could be included in a consent condition review or included in a kaitaki monitoring plan. Whiti alluded to the decommissioning of Pond 1 earlier, and this is a consent condition that's in the Te Maunga air discharge consent. And so that required that Pond 1 be decommissioned by 2012. And there's disagreement as to the meaning of the word decommission. And I'm not too sure what the pond was stopped being used by, but it wasn't stopped being used until 2019. So there was a bit of a non-compliance with that condition, and a recommendation in the report is that TCC and Tangata Whenua work together through the committee to agree the future use of Pond 1. Ka pai. And these are the remaining consents. So 62822 allows emergency discharge of wastewater into Tauranga Harbour when there are overflows, so in extreme weather events. There are no conditions in this consent that require sampling, monitoring or reporting of monitoring results, which could be something that's looked at in a condition review or kaitiaki monitoring plan. There were 2 overflow events in March and May 2023, which were reported on per consent conditions. A recommendation for this consent is that TCC investigates improving the accuracy of how much discharges or how much overflow or wastewater is discharged into the environment. And this is similar for consent 62885, emergency discharges from Te Maunga, although there have been no discharges during this reporting period. The next consent is 62886, which allows treated wastewater from Chapel Street to be used to irrigate, I think, 8 sites around Tauranga City. This wasn't used in the reporting period. However, TCC have noted that they are looking into using treated wastewater to irrigate newly planted juvenile trees at a new site, which may result in a new consent being applied for. And the recommendation there is that tangata whenua are involved in that decision making, and that can be through the wastewater program business case, the committee, or direct consultation. And the final consent we've reviewed is 65178, which allows the coastal marine area to be occupied with wastewater infrastructure. This requires a 5-yearly report on maintenance works, discharges, inspections, and complaints. I believe TCC were looking into whether that report's been prepared. It was due last September. I don't know if you have an update on that, Radley or Christina.
I was just going to say that it has always been a recommendation about the emergency overflows in terms of improving the accuracy of the actual volumes that might go through. So as you can see there, there have been no discharges from Te Maunga in the last 5 years, and there were some from the Chapel Street, and that's treated wastewater. But the practicalities of doing that from a technical point of view is quite difficult. I'll let Radley perhaps elaborate on that a little bit further, and also about the CMA consent.
So I guess at Chapel Street, what we have is we have a discharge pipe that allows us to send treated wastewater over to Te Maunga. That has a capacity of, I believe, around 750 litres a second. We can accept in at the front end of Chapel Street around 900 litres a second. So when we get these peak events, that's the difference that we're talking about being discharged to the harbour when that occurs. Getting a flow meter on that is quite difficult, just to the way the infrastructure, I guess, is set up. We are required to estimate as part of the, I think Tauranga Māori has already mentioned, we're required to estimate and report that estimation to the Regional Council and confirm that we've been UV treating that water before it enters the harbour, which is the configuration, how it's currently set up. So we know that when we're overflowing, that's why, and so we know what's coming in, we know what we can get going out to Te Maunga, and so that's how we measure that currently. Getting any further sort of accuracy on that is quite a difficult process, and we have looked into it previously, but it's not to say something that we can't continue to look at doing, see if there's other options. In terms of the CMA report, that has been done, and we've double checked on that. So, and we've got a field sheet from the regional council regarding their acceptance of that report. So we can provide that.
Yeah, so we'll include that in our tidy up. Thanks, Te Rangi Marie. Did you have any more comments? No. Thank you.
No.
Okay, we're making good time, Chair. So I'll carry on now and talk about progress towards zero waste and smart growth stretch targets. So I think it's fair to say that when the consent was first granted in the early 2000s, the whole talk at the time was around zero waste, and of course smart growth had some stretch targets. So these are quite specific consent conditions, which I suppose have moved on a little bit since then. Smart growth has had several iterations, and also the conversation, I suppose, is more about minimising waste and thinking about your effects of climate change and a whole heap of other considerations when we talk about sustainability going forward. So what we've done in the report is actually summarise some of the initiatives that Tauranga City does in terms of what you could say is minimising waste or going towards zero waste. And we've got details in there about the commitments to climate change action, so the Climate Change Action Plan, also Council's environmental strategy as well. So effectively, Tauranga City is doing all of these things listed here. But the report itself talks a little bit more about the waste minimisation, management and minimisation plan, which is a legal requirement. And TCC has set and achieved clear goals, including diverting all biosolids through to vermicomposting, and also it reports on things like recycling of construction and demolition waste. We also have included in there a comparison of how the wastewater network performs in terms of overflows in comparison with other New Zealand councils as well. And it does perform pretty well. So, and then we also talk about the environmental compliance, the certification that the council has. And also, you know, the fact that you've got proactive public education campaigns. I think that's probably across the country something that Tauranga has led the way. And so, you know, the Save Our Pipes from Wipes and also the Waterline education program that you have. Similar sized cities around New Zealand, they have something similar, but not quite as advanced as Tauranga City. In terms of continuous improvement, you've got your waste management strategies, and then of course you've got, as we all know, there's a lot of evolving changes in legislation and policy, which Garrett will go into in a little bit more detail. And Tauranga City is doing all the right things in terms of tracking and reporting annually on its waste minimisation activities as well. So in terms of smart growth, so smart growth stretch targets were a point in time. I think they were implemented in about 2003, 2004, so one of the first iterations. So what we've actually talked about in the report is about more holistically what's moved on since then. So, these are our recommendations, but effectively we're just saying maintain diversion of biosolids from your landfill. You know, just keep reporting. Maybe there is actually a proposed national overflow reporting standards, so just being prepared for that. Keep doing the community education keep up to date with legislation and policy changes, continue reporting on your biosolids diversion from landfill, and also set targets for dry and wet weather wastewater overflows with annual reporting to the committee. And that should be happening as a matter of course as part of your annual reporting, which the staff will be doing already. And improve the accuracy, which is what Radley was just explaining before about overflow reporting. Now we'll talk about smart growth. So TCC is part of the Smart Growth Consortium and has worked with stakeholders to address its smart growth targets with oversight in terms of community education. In terms of initiatives, so the consent itself actually refers to waterless toilet technology. So that was actually reviewed in one of the first measure reports and found that on a grand scale, having waterless systems, so effectively your composting type toilets, is not necessarily, there is a place for them, but whole scale across the city in an urban environment, possibly not technically feasible. And then the report also goes into some of the studies that Tauranga City does in terms of looking to improve efficiency and also water conservation as well. And we just recommend that they continue that work. So now I'd like to hand over to Garrett, and he's going to take us through the technological advances section.
Yeah, but the last 5 years there's actually been some quite significant advances in wastewater technology, and just a few photos here of some different sites around New Zealand and the technologies they're employing. The top left there is an indent system, which is a hydrocyclone, and that's a way of separating out solids in wastewater, traditionally done in big clarifier tanks, big circular tanks in a settling process. This is quite a different technology that's being trialled in Mangere. It's also been implemented up in Mangawhai. I know that treatment system, they've had quite significant success with these hydrocyclones, a much smaller footprint, and actually starting to remove a lot of the nutrients that are associated with the solids as well, so actually performing better than expected.
Garrett, can you tell me hydrocyclone, just what that means, and what are we talking about there?
It's basically a way of spinning and concentrating the solids through that very small process. So, a different concept rather than settling, more concentrating through the way that wastewater moves through that system. The system on the right there, that's Te Kauwhata wastewater treatment plant that discharges into Lake Waikare, Waikato District Council, and this system was actually built and commissioned by Waikato Water Care. May not look like much, but that's the most advanced treatment plant in New Zealand now. It operates this new technology, which is the first of its type in the Southern Hemisphere, called membrane-activated bioreactor. And that's a way of removing nutrients through very thin membranes. It's normally done in big open tanks, concrete tanks, which take a lot of aeration and energy. And this system doesn't do that, it just does it through diffusing air finely through these membranes. And that means you don't need these big concrete and steel tanks. This is stainless steel tanks here, and you're able to achieve all of that in a much smaller footprint. What that also means is you don't need a lot of groundworks and foundations. That's just on a normal concrete slab there. So the sort of cost of all the civil works, the steel and concrete, have come down a lot. The technology is still expensive, but it does show some promise now. We are actually having people coming from outside of New Zealand to visit that site. At the back end of the plant there on the right-hand side is the more traditional membrane for filtering out the solids. That technology has come down in price a lot over recent years, traditionally from the water treatment side of things. now being implemented around New Zealand on the wastewater treatment. On the bottom left there is a photo from Wanaka, and these are types of diffuser frames or aeration frames, which actually diffuse air into the wastewater a lot more effectively than traditional big diffusers or big mechanical units or blower systems. So there's been quite a bit happening in the last few years. The next slide, Christina. So these different technical developments, they actually present quite a lot of opportunities, but they also present some challenges around retrofitting a lot of these systems. Since 2020, there's not only been a focus on treatment, like those photos, but also continuing focus on reuse of wastewater, but also reuse of biosolids and sludge. And a lot of global trends around particularly a lot of the emerging contaminants that are present in the biosolids. It's emerging contaminants, new types of contaminants like PFAS, which is the new sort of dioxin, and how that can be removed through different treatment processes, particularly a lot of technologies from the States that look at that now. There is a need, though, to sort of review how applicable those technologies are available in a New Zealand context, being at the end of the world. There's quite a lot of cost in implementing those technologies, but we are starting to see some of those examples come to New Zealand now, like Te Kaupara. But there is still a driver really for those sustainability and efficiency type considerations going forward in the wastewater scheme. Christina, were you going to talk about the recommendations slide on this?
Yeah, I can do that. So in terms of what's applicable to Tamanga and to Chapel Street, and these are really for Tauranga City to consider going forward. I mean, there is quite an in-place plan already, and this actually interweaves into the program business case and also the master plans for both sites. But going forward, it may be beneficial for them to consider if it can be retrofitted, and that's the key point, I think, is that if you can retrofit new technology into your plant and it makes a cost sense to do that to improve aeration, so improving oxygen transfer into your process, then perhaps consider those modern style panel diffusers. In terms of Tamanga, have a look at how you can capture and reuse, treat. Basically what that second line is saying is look at your liquid stream, but also look at your solids. So at the moment, there is an existing biosolids management strategy, and the current processes for vermicomposting. But what we're also looking at is a technical assessment for the future, because the backup at the moment to doing that, if, say, vermicomposting was no longer available, would be is that you would be paying to put your biosolids into landfills. So, the council is quite interested in, what are other things that you can do to recover energy, and also to have to front foot, I suppose, appropriate treatment of biosolids as well. And then also with reference to what Garrett was talking about in terms of some of these new MBR or MABR technology. So these are membrane bioreactors. And one of the advantages is that they take up less of a footprint, and you've got less concrete considered. So maybe in the future, if you were having to expand capacity at Tamanga, that you would consider those new technologies, particularly if the costs of those technologies come down. And in terms of Chapel Street, it's all about optimisation. So optimising and looking at ways that they can actually improve, and it's like a continuous improvement, but looking for ways to make sure that biosolids are treated appropriately at Chapel Street, and that recommendations from Maraerea are that tangata whenua are actively involved in evaluating and selecting new treatment technologies, aligning this work with existing projects which are under the Wastewater Program business case to prevent duplication. So the vehicle has been to date through the Wastewater Program business case, and of course through this committee. And to assess tangata whenua to join council staff and the committee in terms of assessing wastewater treatment options against their cultural values and supporting the identification of preferred solutions. So Radley or Tarangi Marie, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think recommendations for this condition are around making sure tangata whenua are involved in that decision making and being able to understand the technology so that they can be informed to help with decision making.
Yeah, thank you. So another consent condition is to do with the cost of any potential technological changes as having regard to the best practicable option for addressing the relevant issues. So what we're saying here is effectively is that council has a process for that already, and it's called the long-term plan. And you also have your 30-year investment plan and infrastructure strategy. And then, of course, a lot of these technological changes or looking at what is the best practical option to help service for the long term is done through the Wastewater Program business case. And just the last line there is about, adopting innovative and alternative wastewater technologies can help TCC, but also just going back to the point that that was made before, is that it's got to be appropriate for the current situation. So it's got to be able to be retrofitted, and obviously it's got to be proven technology as well. So recommendations from Maraerea are that tangata whenua will continue to be involved in cost and BPO, which is best practical option, analysis through the program business case. And that also TCC will consult publicly on proposed capital investments. So basically what it already does through the long-term plan and infrastructure strategy. Over to you, Garrett. You're going to take us through some legislation and policy changes.
There's been a lot happening in the last 5 years. Obviously, previous government did away with the Resource Management Act and brought in the Natural Built Environments Act. Changing government did away with the Natural Built Environments Act and brought the RMA back again. There's been some national direction changes that are out for consultation now, particularly in relation to the freshwater space and Te Mana o Te Wai, and some options around that which are being consulted on, which also include removing the concept of Te Mana o Te Wai completely from that national direction. There's also the ongoing resource management reform and the government's next version of the RMA, yet to be consulted on, still coming. Probably the most relevant, though, is the Water Services Authority Taumata Arawai National Wastewater Standards that were consulted upon earlier in the year, around February, March. And the idea behind that is to have a nationally consistent set of wastewater standards for different receiving environments throughout the country. So rather than each regional council going through a consent process and setting individual standards, Taumata Arawai has said, look, across the country this is just too inconsistent there's too many examples of these processes taking too long. We've got a lot of non-compliant discharges. They've come out for consultation on a number of sort of different receiving environments and different standards that apply to those receiving environments, different freshwater standards, different marine standards. They had an ocean outfall standard which applied to any discharges into the open ocean in an outfall longer than 500 metres, and that standard only had a limit on ammonia, quite a permissive limit, and I know there's been a lot of submissions received on that saying that is not strict enough, doesn't reflect what's actually happening in more recent consent processes. So Taumata Arawai is actually going through a process of sort of responding to those submissions now. We're expecting an order in council around August, September, and for those standards to be law towards the end of the year, which will come into effect when the current consent expires. Sort of one of the other sort of drivers for Taumata Arawai is doing that is to say, hey, if you've got a consent expiring in 10 years and there's some limits in the national standards that you're not achieving, you can actually start setting aside budgets. So by the time that consent expires, you're ready for that upgrade rather than going through a consent process and then taking 10 years to actually reach that standard. Obviously, local water done well. Various iterations on that, I'm sure you're across that, but in terms of financing and planning for these upgrades, there's obviously a relationship to that process as well. In terms of our recommendations, it's really just to keep a watching brief on this legislative and policy changes and working alongside tangata whenua as partners to submit on any of these national changes. There's opportunities to do that and influence at the policy level. There's obviously increasing climate change risk. There's national direction coming out on that in relation to national natural hazards and the management of at-risk infrastructure, and wastewater and water services are a key part of that. And really that continuing partnership approach with mana whenua, but also the regulatory authorities on that side of things as well, is also a key recommendation.
So I'd just like to add to that too, that the report also covers, those are some of those key changes which are to do with environmental compliance and also wastewater activities. And as we know, it's a bit of a moving feast at the moment, so there's proposed changes and things, but also the report goes into more detail about some of those, but also includes the changes with specifically to do with cultural legislation as well, and describes the recent Ranganui deed of settlement, and also like the iwi harbour management plan, so also that key framework as well, so just so you know. Te rangi Maria, are we going to do this together? So,
Yep.
So first one is key conclusions. So I'll let you talk to these.
Yep, so for compliance, TCC is largely compliant across consent conditions. In terms of adequacy and scope of the sampling and monitoring conditions, there's a concern that there are a lack of conditions requiring adherence to quality standards or trigger levels and the mitigation of environmental effects. And I think one we could also probably add there is that there's a lack of understanding of cultural effects, and we consider that this can be addressed through a consent condition review and or kaitiaki monitoring plan.
So I'd just like to elaborate on that too, and it's probably some of those conditions that we're talking about, they are conditions which say things like there shall be no conspicuous oil coming from the outfall or something like that. And they tend to be conditions which are put in there for the regional council to be able to react to if there were issues at a discharge or something like that. So they're not actually things that are proactively monitored. Would you put some of those in a consent today? Maybe, or maybe not. So just wanting to just sort of clarify that picture. Radley, did you have anything on that?
Yeah, I guess those conditions are there for the regional council to respond if, for example, they get a call from a member of the public or the community that sees something that they think, well, what's this? Those sort of visual clarity, or, you know, as you say, oily residues or whatever it might be, that's enables them to kick off their, I guess, their investigations and come back to potentially those that may be responsible and say, hey, you know, you're not supposed to be producing a discharge that creates this effect. So they're a reactive condition rather than a proactive monitoring condition that the regional council would go out and do on a regular basis.
And in terms of, we mentioned it earlier on, but it's not specified here, is I think one of the key takeaways is that the shellfish monitoring required under the consent, Sharon DeLuca, our marine ecologist, has indicated that we could actually, or council could do some more meaningful analysis or monitoring around that. And so the vehicle that's been proposed by Marearea is a kaitiaki monitoring plan, and that's developed in consultation with tangata whenua, but also with Sharon as a marine ecologist who can provide a little bit of guidance on the local environment from a different perspective. And then in terms of progress towards zero waste and smart growth stretch targets, recommendations are fairly just continue to report back on progress and improve data accuracy where you can. Consider if the smart growth targets are still relevant, and also align perhaps to the Tauranga City Wastewater Program business case. One of the things that we did also pick up too was, but I think that's really with the committee, that's the committee to determine is the effectiveness of the Environmental Mitigation and Enhancement Fund, because that is actually a consent condition, so there has been some comments provided on that, but it's more in terms of how it's been functioning to date. But our understanding is that's with the committee to make any decisions on that fund. So in terms of technological developments in waste management, so yeah, there's opportunities and challenges, and I think we've talked enough about that already. Tangata whenua would like to be involved in the review of any technological advances, particularly through the Wastewater Program business case. And as Garrett mentioned before, just keep a watching brief, as we all are, on changes to do with legislation and policy, and continued collaboration with tangata whenua partners, regulatory authorities, and also, of course, importantly, our customers as well. So we thought that we've provided you with an example kaitiaki monitoring plan, and Te Rangi Marea is going to explain a little bit more about it. We ask that this is not shared outside of this forum, the kaitiaki monitoring plan, and that is because the proposed development of that is to be done with tangata whenua. So the whole purpose of sharing that with you today is just to give you a bit of an idea of what it might contain. Kia ora, over to you, Te Rangi Marea.
Hapai. So as I discussed earlier in the consent compliance review, there are a number of conditions that don't have standards to meet in terms of water quality or sediment quality, shellfish quality. For some conditions, there's no requirement to follow up on what an environmental effect may have been, for example, in terms of the emergency discharges. And so there is a little bit of a gap in understanding what the environmental effects are. Plus, there is no focus on what cultural effects are from the wastewater system. And so this presents an opportunity to address those gaps through a kaitiaki monitoring plan, which I believe has the added benefit of involving tangata whenua and enabling tangata whenua to exercise kaitiakitanga in terms of getting out into the environment, monitoring, sampling, analysing data, and coming up with plans to restore the environment if that's what's required. And it has the benefit of understanding what the cultural effects are, as well as partnership building between tangata whenua and council. And so what we've, I think maybe there's a handout of a sample kaitiaki monitoring plan.
Yes, there is. So each person should have a copy of the example, and that's the one I've asked to just not be shared outside this forum.
Yeah, and so what we're doing with this kaitiaki monitoring plan is creating a draft, which then needs to go back to kaitiaki to input into, to analyse and give their feedback and make changes. So it's a bit of a process, and that's why it won't be shared like the desktop, I guess. The desktop version of the kaitiaki monitoring plan won't be shared because that it's subject to change if it once it goes through the process of wānanga with tangata whenua. But what we are creating is follows this framework that's in the slide. So we look at some values or kaupapa as the base for a kaitiaki monitoring plan. So the one in the handout is kaitiakitanga. And that the value then has a whāinga or an objective. And so for kaitiakitanga, that objective or whāinga is that the taiao is in a state of mauri ora, and we protect the mauri of taiao from the impacts of wastewater and enhance the mauri of taiao. You then have tohu, which are indicators that are observed when kaitiaki is upheld, as well as the huarahi or method for measuring that tohu. And so the desktop version of this kaitiaki monitoring plan that we're creating is based on kōrero that's been shared through the wastewater program business case by tangata whenua. So through the program business case, tangata whenua have identified issues, key service requirements, and I guess objectives and outcomes that tangata whenua would like to see in terms of the wastewater system and tauranga. And so this desktop version of the plan has drawn on that kōrero, I guess as a way to ensure that it's not just being created by a consultant out to the side, but that it's drawing on the kōrero that tangata whenua have already shared. And so if you look at the sample kaitiaki plan, a couple of the tohu, one is that mahinga kai are safe to consume, diverse and abundant. And if you go to Appendix A of the kaitiaki monitoring plan, you'll see that, for example, for shellfish, You would measure size, number, diversity, and whether it's safe for consumption. And for fish, that would be a visual observation. And so we've had a bit of a korero with Sharon to understand what are some things that we need that are useful to measure and monitor to help us to understand if we're achieving that whāinga. So to help us understand that mahinga kai is safe to consume, diverse and abundant, and we've come up with these attributes such as measuring shellfish, fish, understanding the presence of exotic or invasive species, understanding the ability to access mahinga kai, and another whāinga for kaitakitanga is that why water is clear and free from contaminants, and Sharon's advice is that the best way to understand water quality is to measure sediment. So there's measurements in there in terms of what you'd measure in sediment to understand water quality. And so this is something we're working on at the moment and refining to have as an outcome of our participation in producing the MUTA report, and then following this process or following the drafting of the desktop version of the Kaitaki monitoring plan, being able to take that out in wānanga with tangata whenua and Kaitaki to further refine and get it ready to be implemented. Hapai.
Kia ora, thank you, Te Rangi Mario. So, Chair, that actually ends our presentation. Thank you for listening to us today.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just wanted to acknowledge first, before we go into questions, the work that's gone into the report. It's clearly a weighty tome, but you can see the quality in the report. And I think too, it was also important to acknowledge the fact that this is the first time we've had an integrated report. And I think it seems to me it's worked out really well, having it all of the recommendations and findings all in one report rather than two separate reports. So I think that's been a really good move and something for the future. Turning then to questions from the committee.
Kia ora, thank you for the report. It's actually good to kind of let that flow and take good stock of what is being shared here. I'm just going to come straight to the conclusion around the main points that are captured there, and I'm just suggesting, based on what I've heard, some priority areas. I suppose from my experience, both in the taiao and on this committee. And looking on the last page there, page 15, I really believe there needs to be a separate bullet point, kaitiakitanga. Okay, and then perhaps the Environmental Mitigation Enhancement Fund can sit in there. And kind of two key aspects that I had heard, we're dealing with the water resources, the source is our fresh water, especially as standards are being set within the national framework, environmental standards. So I think that's what we're looking for around setting limits, and that it's all going to be beneficial. And mahinga kai, with regards to a strong emphasis, both from the start, if you were here and you could recall the objections through the court and what's captured in the methodology and scope of the kaitiaki plan proposed, or example, mahinga kai, shellfish. And I was a bit concerned. I like the technology, but we got a legend with technology with Rata, with the tuki, the eds, and you cut down the tree without doing the karakia. But once the protocols were followed, we were able to use that tuki, obviously, to make our canoe, and here we are here. So based on that kind of principle, thinking around technology is that that's the wider principle. But when I look at the aspects of options going forward, it's te manga this, te manga that. And I think we've got, if I look at the sewage network, you know, the Southern Highway, Southern Pipeline, which is a sewage highway, and the potential for the growth of adding on to that, is that we need to be looking at te manga and other areas, because which brings into another aspect which Whiti, and it's been right there from the beginning, was the decommissioning. And I think that decommissioning could sit under, because in principle we're talking about decommissioning, but it's just what does that look like, and I think that could sit within the bullet point in the range of technology. Yeah. I'm just doing it on the basis this is a workshop and we're still fashioning the, drafting and getting back to finalising this in order for us to. And there was one other little one which implications. I think I've lost it, but yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora. Now, just looking at the slides, marere rea, what is that in terms of an entity? It's next to, I see
It's
a logo.
Te Rangi Māori. Yeah.
Oh,
So that's her
hello.
company, Te Marere.
Māori. So,
Te mangara.
do you want to? Oh, you can answer. Yeah, te Māori, Te Rangi Māori, on behalf of.
So it's a inanga. So this, yeah, my dad gave the name. It's from when he was growing up, and they would, as kids, chase the māori up the river into the side pools where his aunties would be waiting with nets to catch them. So that's where the name comes from.
Okay, so like white bait you were talking about. Yeah. Oh, cool. Thanks for clarifying that. But the next question is around technology, and you mentioned sort of reference to capital costs, but that would then have associated operational costs. And think about the Te Kawhata plant. How does that compare with more traditional plants in terms of that, the operating cost of that advanced technology?
So I'll let Radley answer that one, but effectively any sort of decision making needs to consider whole of life cost. But Radley, you'll be able to answer that in more detail.
I might let Garrett just inform us about the energy required to run that particular technology, because he's the expert. But in terms of, as Christina says, it's around whole of life costs, right? And we are continuing to do work on how we can get the best efficiency out of the infrastructure that we already have, as well as what might come in the future in terms of emissions, energy reduction opportunities, things that we're doing at Chapel Street, for example, that will increase the amount of methane that we can produce and therefore lower energy costs. So all these technologies have a balance in terms of the energy they require, or there are opportunities for you to reduce operating costs because of the certain uniqueness that they have. Well,
Yeah, for the Tico Fitter example, it has quite low operating costs, a lot less energy and chemical use. Still very high capital cost at the moment though, so the whole of life cost is still high. We'd expect that to come down in the next several years though. But that technology is really focused around trying to minimise all this excessive energy use and big blower aeration equipment that's not very effective.
So I'll talk about MABR and stuff. Yeah. Okay. So just for a little bit of scene setting, in terms of electricity costs for the city, you're probably aware that the wastewater activity is the highest electricity cost. And so council is always looking for ways to improve efficiency. The scope of this particular report is to comment on new technologies and the appropriateness that it might apply. Before council would choose any technology, they would need to look at the whole of life cost. You'd need to look at your full wellbeing, so your social, your cultural, your environmental, and your energy as well. So like Garrett said, there are pros and cons, and all of those would need to be considered in what you would call a multi-criteria analysis. And then that would inform a business case for your LTP. So part of that is done under the program business case, but also just part of council business as well.
Can I ask a follow-up, if you don't mind, Rick? Just a more direct, I guess, question related to the difference in cost between the new and the existing technologies. For example, comparing the new technologies you referred to compared to, say, another clarifier in a bioreactor. I don't know if you're able to, but in terms of cost, which one would be cheaper or more expensive?
I think that's something for the business case, isn't it? Looking at those options.
Because it's also other stuff. So say, for example, you'd look at the ability, say, for an MABR or something like that, the ability for it to cope during extreme weather events. So, yeah, so it's not a straightforward answer at this stage because you would balance it all up.
The other matter, and it was raised earlier around the decommissioning of Pond 1, what's the current situation in terms of TCC's opinion on what that means versus perhaps others? Where's TCC at in terms of what decommission means?
So our understanding in terms of the consent was around the fact that it was a sludge pond and we were discharging sludge to the pond to stabilise before, as a way of disposal, I guess, of the biosolids that comes from the plant. So the current biosolids management strategy was, stage one was to commission the thickening and dewatering plant to enable us to stop that disposal into the pond of the sludge. So in terms of complying with that consent condition, that's where that initial management strategy went, and we believe that we've obviously decommissioned that pond as a sludge pond. It is still at this stage required for that ability for us to balance flows in those peak events. I don't want Fiddy and Des or Spencer, you may want to discuss this around interpretations around whether that is complying with the condition or not. But at this stage, the capacity that we have to utilise that pond system enables us to, I guess, capture those increased flows and hold on to them instead of discharging into the harbour because of the restrictions we have with the outfall. So we essentially, just like at Chapel Street, I was explaining earlier around the difference in flows that we can that leave Chapel Street and enter, it's the same at Tamunga. We have much more flow coming in than we can discharge through the outfall in those peak events. And so those ponds are essential for us to be able to manage that and not discharge to the harbour instead.
In terms of that and the change in land use from being for sludge purposes now to balance flows, is there any requirement to undergo a change, given it's a change of land use, to reconsent that?
So these, although we have a suite of consents for different things, they are sort of a package. And so what you see is that there are conditions in a number of the consents around the future use of those ponds, and Pond 1 in particular. So although the air discharge consent talks around the decommissioning of the pond, I think it may be the seepage consent talks around a future use, or the main consent talks around how that future use and discussion is a function of the committee. So that although they're separate consents, they sort of all have a bit to play in terms of what that might look like. And it's not necessary that there is a reconsenting required for us to, for whatever that looks like, I guess.
So meaning that you consider it to be compliant currently? So
at this stage, both us and I believe the Regional Council believe that we're compliant in terms of we're no longer using it as a sludge pond. So that's not the only.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the mahi there. Probably along the lines of Des around and what's been said around the technological advances, and I think we all know in this fast-changing world there's some great technologies out there merging in with Mātauranga Māori. So page 20, you had Mangere, Wanaka and Te Kaupata as examples. And then in 22, you talk around tangata whenua actively involved in evaluating that technology. And this may be a question for you, Te Rangi Mārie. Do we know how involved tangata whenua were in those ones? So that would be the first question I would be asking about that technology. Do we know, or is that something that we'd want to find out as a priority before we look at that? Because I would be asking the mana whenua of that rohe. I know we've got different challenges here in the moana, but I would have thought the impacts would be the same. So I'm not sure whether that's a question for you, Te Rangi Mārie, or whoever, or is that something we can pick up?
Yeah, I'm not sure how tangata whenua were involved in decision making in those areas, but yeah, Garrett might know, but that's a good point, and yeah, it would be good to speak to tangata whenua if they were involved and get their whakaaro on it.
Yeah, Garrett, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can talk about Te Kaupata. The discharge from this wastewater system has been highly offensive for many decades. An old pond system discharging to a culturally sensitive lake. So there has been a working group as part of the existing consent working on a solution for the last 15 years. And the tangata whenua have been deeply involved in the selection of that. This plant is now compliant with its discharge consent after being many years of non-compliant. And the focus of the project now is looking at the future consent, because this consent still has a number of years to run on it.
So if you like, I can speak to how we got to where we're at with the Tamunga plant. So I was a treatment plant manager back in the day when that plant was constructed, and I was running that plant and Chapel Street and the water plants. So there was extensive consultation with iwi at the time, and there was a lot of input into the type of plant that we were going to build, the type of effluent that it would produce, and the cultural mitigation around that. And if you like, I can speak to that for a couple of minutes. The brief that we got was to build the at the lowest capital cost, get the best quality water possible. And that's how we ended up selecting that type of, so a single tank treatment system, if you like, extended aeration with nutrient removal, and it gives a very high quality effluent. As far as the cultural mitigation went, we spent a lot of time working on how that would come, on how that would look and how it would work. We went to the lengths of hiring an aircraft and leasing an aircraft for a day and taking about 8 members of the advisory group. They were all iwi members, and we flew to Whangarei, and they had a look at the treatment processes at Whangarei and the wetland system that Whangarei had at that time. They loved it, thought it was great, and said, we want you to build wetlands, and if you do that and those wetlands are sealed, so there's no percolating out the bottom of those wetlands, as far as we're concerned, you are having contact with Papatūānuku, and you will have a system that we're prepared to accept. So we went through that. Now this took a few years, obviously, of work to get to that point. And then a couple of us went to the States and had a look at various treatment technologies and came back and put these in front of the committee, and it was approved, and we ended up designing and constructing the Tamunga wastewater plant as it is today. And the big part of that was decommissioning of the ponds, because the ponds, all we did was pour wastewater into the ponds and they worked as an oxidation pond. So putting in a biological treatment, a secondary treatment system, really raised the standard dramatically, orders of magnitude. And then passing through a wetland, and we now also have UV disinfection, so it's close to bathing water standards when it's discharged. So back in the day, in the 90s, when that was done, and by the way, the plane that we hired was Bob Owens, the grandfather of our current mayor, owned that plane. So some of the members of the committee may be related to some of the people that we took. I know Carlton Bidwell was related to one of the members that we flew up there on the plane at the time. I hope that assists. And that was not for the 2005 consent. I'm talking about way back in the 90s when the plant was first built. Yeah.
Choice before I was alive. Nah, jokes. Jokes. Tēnā tātou. Thank you guys for your presentation. My question's perhaps more directed at our staff, whether it be you guys over there or our Takawainga team. A few of our other water-related committees are discussing things like a Māori model, kaitiaki monitoring plans, etc. It's my view that it's probably more impactful and will create better synergies and efficiencies if we elevate this next step of developing a kaitiaki monitoring program to include everyone and doing it together, because there's going to be natural overlaps with what Waiari's doing to what this committee's doing to what da-da-da's doing to what da-da-da's doing. Yeah, we might get better bang for buck with a more joined up approach. So is that in the pipeline, or was the plan just to develop these in isolation?
We haven't given that consideration yet, but we'll take some guidance from the committee on that if you have a particular view. Yeah.
Good. Thank you guys for that. Yeah, it was really interesting. Couple of questions. Firstly, around the report. I was just curious, the numbers you said around the difference in the flows between into Chapel Street and out, and then sort of what sort of event triggers that outfall to sea? I was just curious. First one.
Yeah, so there's different events will have different impacts, right? But an event that creates flows to the plant that are over our capability to treat them and process them properly into the pipeline that goes to Tamunga. So that could be from a certain area of town that's got a very large rainfall event, or it could be more spread over the city, but a smaller event, if you like. So, but they're considered to be peak events that essentially mean we have stormwater entering the wastewater network and can be almost sort of double the flow that we would normally receive on a general day. So they're few and far between. I believe for the application and consenting, the estimation was that we would have one of those events every sort of 5 years or so at that time, based on whatever a 100-year rain event was at that time, I would imagine.
And just another curiosity, really, that 62886, the discharge to land, which you said has never been used. Again, I mean, just in thinking what type of event would trigger that, just, yeah, mostly curiosity.
Yeah, so that you're talking about the consent with 8 different areas.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a recycled water consent.
Okay.
We used to use it back in probably sort of early 2000s. It was sending recycled water to places like the Domain, Amanu golf course at the time. The conditions in it were understandably, restrictive in terms of what you could, the quality of the water, and it was deemed at the time that even though when we met those conditions, there was a perceived, issue, yes, in terms of the community's reaction to that. So we, that use was discontinued. Amanu golf course, for example, went down the bore water route, and so yeah, that's the reason that we no longer use it essentially. But at the time, we did use it for a number of years. When it sort of also coincided with droughts and water restrictions and that kind of thing. So at the time when it was being applied for, it was just thought to be, it would be useful. What we're looking at doing now is it's slightly different in terms of having the ability to utilise some of the water that we obviously produce at Tamunga and Chapel Street for specific uses around town. The Spaces and Places team have come to us and asked if that would be a possibility. We have things like the Water Watchers plan at the moment, which is looking to obviously conserve water at various times throughout the year and utilise, reticulated water for, those uses that, it really should be preserved for, which is, drinking and that kind of thing. So if we can find an alternative source for vegetation, another one might be something like dust suppression, then that would obviously take some pressure off our requirements in those certain parts of the year, and help with that conservation effort that we're looking at doing.
And just one, if I may, to you, Te Rangi Māori, just on the Kaitiaki monitoring plan, just around the accessibility or the measurement units. I sort of get everything else, but on the measurements around accessibility, I'm sort of not quite understanding. I mean, it just appears to be that's to do largely with whereabouts in the environment it is, whether it's deep water or moderate or shallow, or as a measure. I don't quite understand that part of it, but if you just got a little bit of a flesh out of that, it'd be good.
Yeah, I think firstly that this is a work in process, but I guess for tangata whenua it's important to actually be able to access mahinga kai, and I think for some sites that access has been hindered by different, I guess, like the imposition of infrastructure and the different, like the landfill, the wastewater treatment plant, those types of things on the edge of the tahuna. It's just not as easy to access mahinga kai anymore. And so this attribute looks at how difficult it is to access, to give, I guess, a picture of that, to inform decision making around, well, how could Kaitiaki, how could we change things so that Kaitiaki could access the taiao easier? if that makes sense.
Oh, before you go, Fitzy, we were meant to have opened the meeting formally at 2:00. It's now 2:18, and I know there's another meeting at 3:00 that some or all of us are meant to be participating in. So I wonder whether we do that. We've had a karakia, so I think we're still living underneath that for the moment, and I don't think there's any apologies. Des, I think you had a late item you wanted to add, so we need to talk about that at some point, but I wonder whether we can move to the business, which is the resolution or the recommendation that we receive and endorse this draft report. We can still ask questions and so forth, but I just wanted to formally open the meeting so we can record our discussions, and if we do adopt the recommendation, we can do so. Is there anything else I've missed? No? All right. Well, look, in terms of the draft report, can I just ask one question about it? It notes that we're adopting, or a recommendation that we adopt the draft report. Is our adoption of it mean it gets finalised, or is there some further work to be done to make it final, and therefore we'll be adopting the final version at some point in the future?
So just to clarify that, last week, Tarangi Marie and I met with council staff and also tangata whenua members of the committee to review our conclusions and recommendations. So they have been, we've had feedback on that. So we're at 90%. Chair. So I think what we need to do is just do a little bit more finalising and tidy up, but it does not change the conclusions and recommendations provided by Becca and by Marea. It's more the detail that is behind that. So just doing some tidy ups, making sure that we are being factually correct in terms of some of those minor details. As well, and that we're happy with it before it is submitted to the Regional Council. But the conclusions and recommendations of that report do not change.
Oh, just speaking to that, I had some suggestions around those, given that we were coming in here to finalise them, as being part of this working group in particular. From tangata whenua perspective, meeting prior a couple of weeks earlier, kind of came with a view to, was still work in progress, to add any, if any, recommendations. That's up to the, obviously to the committee. Some changes or additions, like I'd spout out there earlier, with the kaitiaki being specific. And further.
Because I was thinking, we agreed to the receiving it and the finish of it, but it's also like you might say the 10% you're talking about is the cultural stuff that's got to be put in and then agreed to, eh?
Oh, it might be Tarangi Marie's. Yeah. Tarangi Marie, could you please answer that question from Whiti? That's to do, I think, with the intention of the kaitiaki monitoring plan.
Can you say that question again, please, Whiti, to make sure I understand it?
Yeah, well, Des queried that will this be final, and Christina said, well, you might as well say 90%. Hey, even though we're recommending it to be signed off today, but I'm assuming it's the kaitiaki monitoring plan that's going to finish it off. Hey,
yeah. Yeah, so a recommendation of the report is to create a kaitiaki monitoring plan, and the intention is to put the sample in, but that the plan is created following the, I guess, submission of the report to Regional Council, or following the endorsement of the report today, because it still needs to go through a process of being endorsed by tangata whenua kaitiaki and getting that on the ground knowledge. There's still quite a bit of work to do on it. So the intention isn't to put a draft in there, it's just to keep that sample in there. And I don't think I'd want to put a draft in there in case it changes quite a bit through wānanga with the kaitiaki.
Yeah, I'm just following up from where I sort of queried last week, making sure that when your draft plan does come in for acceptance and that we're going to have a tussle over that. That was going to go into the report, the final report.
Can I
comment on that?
Rod, sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so the recommendation is in the report, right? And all the work on that would come after. So we're not finalising the monitoring program today.
Oh, sorry, just to reiterate, it was actually page 29 where I had asked, maybe in summary for key conclusions and recommendations to have a specific bullet point for kaitiakitanga, and perhaps the mitigation environmental fund can fit under there, include mahinga kai and fresh water, because of the resource and the material that was brought up, the various issues through the presentation.
So I'd like to acknowledge, thank you, Des. So you recommended, and I've noted down for Te Rangi Marae as an action. You talked about including some key focus areas, which includes kaitiakitanga, like you just said, and also mahinga kai. So we will take that as an action to update the report with that information. Kia ora.
There you go.
Sorry, I was just going to suggest that as long as it is a draft report and we do see the final report, I'd be happy to move the motion as written.
Yeah, just a couple of comments. First one, tautoko hautapu's kōrero about adding some of the other committees there, because it goes to Des' late items, some of the recommendations that there. Now, the reuse of the treated wastewater, and reasonings why it's not going on, like the domain and that, public perception and that. I think there's got to be a good education program, and just engaging with the ratepayers out there about that resource, and it's not so dangerous or whatever. So that one there, and when you've got compliance and performance, and largely compliant across the consent conditions, but when you have a look at the cultural input of it all, to me it's it's not compliant, hey, you know, and a lot of reasons too, and some of the, because we haven't set targets and stuff like that, but I don't know, I'm just thinking that for our sake as tangata whenua, some sort of statement should be put in there under that compliance and performance, you know, just balancing it out and saying, well, you know, a lot of the cultural stuff hasn't been met, so it's not compliant. To me, I don't know, because I'd actually like to go to those meetings with you when you go and see the regional council to talk about the compliance, because I want to hear what's been said and then, you know, think back.
Thanks, Freddie. I guess when we're talking about compliance, we're talking around the compliance with the conditions that the regional council have set. They are not necessarily the same as what you're talking about, right? So when you're talking about how you feel about compliance with, you know, that's slightly different. So I guess what Becca and Tarangi Māori are reporting on are more around compliance with those conditions that have been set by regional council. Happy for you to come along to one of those chats, by the way. So yeah.
Sorry, got one more here. I mean, back on 20.1F, you know, and it goes back to the compliance as well. For me, you know, like you got Taranga's wastewater infrastructure remains vulnerable to increasing impact of climate change and flooding, and that. Just a comment, I'll say, we're still thinking of laying the wastewater network down the coast, you know, and to me that's, you know, predetermining you're not going to be compliant because you might get a tsunami or whatever. Hey, yeah, I just bring back to that, you know, because we're talking about those things in our plannings and the different committees that we're at. So, yeah, well, I'm sort of going backwards from here.
Can we do this, Fitzy?
Yeah,
because
sorry.
I think for now there's an ongoing conversation with the project business case, and there's an opportunity for us to continue discussing the material that's in this report and what flows from it, because it is a snapshot report in a sense. And so it's just taking the position as we are today and sort of making some comment and finding and recommendations. The issue we've got immediately is the motion, which is to receive and endorse the report, subject to those minor changes that are contemplated of a sort of cosmetic nature. So it's just really, I think, if we can focus on that for now. If we have other comments regarding the report or issues to flow out of it, excuse the pun, is you know, we can deal with those in due course. But I think I'd be keen to get the resolution put and decided on, and I'm mindful that there's a meeting at 3 o'clock that we're 2:30. No, I think it moved it back to 3, didn't it? Well, that was the last email I got. Maybe you got a. It is 3.
If you're comfortable, Chair. Oh, I'm not even in the committee. Am I allowed? I'm technically not allowed. No.
No,
Damn it.
You were struck
You're
out.
lucky. You're lucky.
Do you want to tell us what it is, and someone else might take it up?
Yeah, I think I heard someone else mentioning that potentially with the support of the committee, and we might not reach it today because we might need to wānanga a bit, but just picking up on elevating the kaitiaki development conversation to a higher, more holistic, inclusive level might be that this committee supports that. I heard someone mentioning it that is actually a part of the committee.
Do you have some wording around it that we could add on?
I wasn't prepared for a follow-up question. So
All right, well, can we do this? Could we deal with the motion as it is, and then if there's a further motion around the kaitiaki monitoring, then we can deal with that separately?
Noted as an action as well for staff to do that, the kaitiaki and
In the report.
which Christina noted earlier.
Sorry, Christina, you.
Tarangi Māori, and I can take that as an action. I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it? So, to look at what's happening with Waiari and just make sure that we're all aligned across. So it's probably been done already, but I think it's a good point that we do that. So we can take that as a recommendation into the report. Thank you.
I think you were out, hei tapu, when I mentioned on slide 29, there are some amendments and specifically mentioning kaitiakitanga that covered a range.
Well, can we add this then, that just see to the recommendation that the staff and contractors will advance the kaitiaki monitoring plan as an action? Is it? I can't remember what you said.
Formalise it with a resolution, but it's already in action. But we can
Oh, is it?
formalise it with a resolution.
Yeah, well, just if... all right. All right. Delete. Okay. Can I do this for now? Can we? So obviously we've got a mover and a seconder of this motion, and just want to check that we're all in favour of the motion. Any opposed? There being none, the motion's carried. And the action to follow up is the development of the kaitiaki monitoring in conjunction with the other work that's going on in relation to other committees, I think I heard correctly. All right, look, just quickly then, Des, obviously we haven't moved whether or not to accept the late item. Do you want to speak to what it is and then we can kind of deal with it from there?
Kia ora, yes. The late item is in relation to, I suppose, the decisions and implications around the water services delivery, in particular our some of the safeguards under our terms of reference, how I see it anyway, any activities that may have effect exercising as the permit holder of this consent. So I brought it to the attention to help give some guidance with just in recent engagements with council in the short time frame to engage, and some of the information in the background to that, if the item is accepted, could be beneficial to this committee and other members participating in this committee in discussing these water service delivery issues. And that's pretty much the background.
Can I just check? So at the last meeting, I recall we made some recommendations around work to be done on local waters done well. Is that a kind of, is it in the same realm as those recommendations, or it's something separate or new?
It involves water services delivery is Three Waters, is local waters done well. So it's within that scope of discussion and discussions that tangata whenua and council have been having a concerted effort on it in recent times. So yeah.
No, it's a point well made. What I'm wondering is, though, the resolution from last meeting of the committee was that the committee wanted input into the decision making on the local waters done well and the issues of the resource consent transfers and so forth. What I'm wondering is that does that cover what you're proposing to put to the meeting, or is it something separate from that?
I think without having that discussion amongst ourselves to set what that scope may be to go forward, basically I'm looking at what are the implications for our committee, in particular with a council-controlled organisation, especially where there's been the issue is no prior engagement, and the implications of that for tangata whenua, and in particular this committee. And then I go on as to boldly recommend, obviously through the committee, that we don't specifically look to partner with Teams Coromandel, which is, So I think probably withdrawing that without further discussions on that particular point, I think it's by way of information, if the committee receives the report, there's a lot of background information, especially with Council's prior commitment to the Three Waters program through the Three Waters Project Steering Group. Obviously, the government has changed, but and I haven't been involved in this council's engagement on this as of recently, and sitting in various forums such as the Rangapu. The council has changed its mind around retracting some of its commitments to consult with the community in tangata whenua. So it's kind of a reminder that just because the Three Waters program's finished, and it's called the Local Waters Done Well, we're actually still discussing the same issues, and a lot of that work and a lot of that engagement and a lot of that process is just sitting there. And now we're faced with a new council. I'm not too sure if they've been informed or are informed about that.
So what I take from that is the issue really is who Tauranga City might partner with in any CCO, which is slightly different from the conversation we had at the last meeting. So I just want to put that to the rest of the committee, their views on whether or not that's something we can deal with today, or whether there's another discussion to be had, and noting that we've got sort of 20 minutes or probably 15 minutes to go to this next meeting.
Thank you, Chair. It's my clear view that to make a recommendation in terms of support or otherwise, or a view of a potential partner through Local Waters Done Well, is clearly outside the scope of this committee, and I think it's important. You know, it's a very prescribed scope, and the committee's largely around a resource consent and scenario. But if the member is, and the committee is desiring to receive the report, you know, perhaps happy to do that. But in terms of the recommendations, it's probably best left alone in terms of a view of this committee.
No, I understand.
I'd just say that from the last meeting, we have initiated some further discussions, which I think we had something last Friday. We're about to go into a further consultation that probably goes a bit deeper into it than we did last week. So I think it's definitely a process, and even beyond the decision that potentially the council will be making in 2 or 3 weeks' time, there's a process we'll be going through which is still involving consultation, and the criteria and who we partner with and all that sort of stuff is still up for discussion going forward. So the next 2 weeks isn't the end of the process by any means, and I think the process that the Mayor's put in place, including this next meeting, is going to help us see the way forward. So take on board what Rick said. Definitely our advice is that this committee has limited scope to do anything on this, and as members we probably have to take that advice.
Anyone? Sorry, Amy?
Yeah, I think I definitely agree around the scope. There isn't anything, depending on where this paper goes, for the tangata whenua members sitting around this committee to express a view, because it would be helpful. It's not therefore a resolution that has any weight, but the views, I think it's fair to say, there's a number of views on Local Waters Done Well, coming from different parts of both tangata whenua as well as the broader community. I think it's fair to say when Thames Coromandel was mentioned in the last Wastewater Committee, there was some angst. Surprise, I think, first, and then some concerns. So I think it's fair to accept that the mandate of this committee does not allow that to actually take that as a resolution. But my whakaaro is that it doesn't, it wouldn't hurt for the tangata whenua members around the committee to express a view. Kia ora.
All right, well, perhaps, given the comments from committee members, I think that's where the matter lies. There's another meeting at 3 to discuss this very issue. I think that's probably the appropriate place for that conversation to continue, and then we see what comes of that. Is that all right, Des? Yeah?
All right, kia ora. I'm happy to have the report received, but no recommendations.
Oh, we passed that resolution?
Yeah, I'm happy, and just like to think it's kind of putting ourselves out there as tangata whenua, you know, time's ticking, and you know, we've got to try as much as possible when we can. I've been involved in the project steering group, and I felt like a lot of wasted effort has gone, just personally, in the resolution of these particular issues for all iwi and hapu. And when you're in that position, you get shot quite a bit from your own iwi and hapu because you're in there. And it's worth, in roles like this, it's worth to make that stand, especially when, the meeting's called by the mayor and face to face, these issues are real. And so I'd just like to thank the committee for your time and kia ora.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, we'll close the hui there. I don't know if we need a karakia if we're going to another meeting where there'll be another karakia, but if anyone wants to close us for the third time, that'd be fine. Des? No?
Close the meeting.
Aye.
Kia ora tātou. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa te ata whai tō tātou arikia e hu karaiti. Me te aroha o te atua me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu ai nei ake, āme.